because of the diversification and the strong incentives that these companies and Gulf states have to diversify away from the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, really interesting on how that leverage is changing. Will, thank you very much for bringing us the report. Senior energy analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, and that report, Peak Hormuz, available on the terminal for subscribers now. Well, coming up, billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller says the US Treasury Secretary's bond buying plan is a mistake. We'll discuss next. This is Bloomberg.
Right now, what are these things?
Right now, this is the solvent yard. So it's not a very exciting part of the whole park. But we are kind of moving up to the fermentation facilities.
And you can smell the fermentation.
Yes.
And it's funny because people always think fermentation is simple, it's easy. It's not.
No, it's very complex. And we have two types of fermentation. One is microbial fermentation, and the other is mammalian cell culture. I mean, I basically could have used yeast to make beer, but now I use yeast to make insulin. So,
amazing. I think that's cooler than using yeast to make beer.
Well, both are cool.
Yeah,
in the goal.
No, but one, you're saving lives.
Yeah, but the other is also a great benefit.
Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura.
I'm Lisa Mateo. And I'm Christina Rafiti. We're tracking breaking news today from Wall Street to Washington. Let's start overseas.
Bloomberg This Weekend, bringing a little Bloomberg into your weekend routine. Watch, listen, stream.
Join me each week on Wall Street Week for stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
Good morning and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Lizzie Burden in London, and these are your top stories. Risking a collision with China, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent threatens to unleash an economic D-Day against Iran and its trading partners. Tentative optimism, Nasdaq futures extend gains with easing pressure on tech stocks ahead of key earnings this week, including AI bellwether Nvidia. Plus, could an extra 40,000 jobs be on the line? Unions fear cuts at Volkswagen could balloon to 140,000 jobs as the CEO prepares to address the company later today. Well, billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller has suggested that his former pupil, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, is making a mistake by wading into the bond market to push down yields. Druckenmiller argues that policymakers should let the bond market do its job. Joining us now is Maria Demircis, economic policy professor at the European University Institute, and we can get the European perspective on all of this now. So Maria, thank you so much for joining us. In your eyes, is Bessent losing credibility? And what signal does what he's doing with the bond market send to European policymakers?
Well, I mean, any finance minister, or treasury minister, has the right to come into the markets and buy back bonds. So the question is this an effective way of affecting the price yields, and how does this interfere with the central bank intentions? I mean, we're expecting the Fed to increase rates at some point. I mean, this is what markets are expecting. So the idea that the Treasury, the finance minister, is intervening somehow contradicts the ability of the central bank to achieve its objectives. So that already creates some confusion into the economy in terms of where we're going with yields in the future, and that is why we've seen some reactions coming to this. Now, when it comes to Europe, I don't think that interferes much with the ability of policymakers in Europe to make their own decisions, be them finance ministers or indeed the European Central Bank, the ECB. However, I will say that to the extent that the interference by the Fed to affect bond yields in the US reflects some concern about the viability of the US debt, that's not good news for the European economy or indeed the world economy. US assets, and treasuries in particular, are the asset of last resort. They are the safe asset. And to the extent that there is some worries about the viability of the safe asset, then the whole world needs to watch very carefully, because it will affect the European economy and it will affect the world economy. It's so systemic to the holdings of insurers, of pension funds, of banks, that, it is really worrying to see something happen to US yields.
Well, yeah, Karen Ward was on the show earlier, and she was making the point not just that treasury markets affect all bond markets, but also that everyone's got their fiscal woes at the moment. So lest we forget the fiscal woes here in Europe, Maria, what can be done on the continent for Europe to grow its way out of debt?
Yeah, indeed. Europe has always had, certainly in the past 10 years, has always had worries about the sustainability of its own debts as well, particularly for big countries. When big countries have fiscal debts and deficits that are high and increasing, then of course that is a sign of concern. Markets don't seem to worry about the sustainability of European debts, but they remain high, and it is important that the productivity agenda, let me call it the Draghi agenda, really advances, because that is the only way to grow out of high debts. And that is absolutely crucial, and I hope that we continue to make the right investments, productivity investments, reforms that are going to remove some of the idiosyncrasies and the problems of the European economy. So the Draghi agenda, in my view, remains priority number one. But of course, we have the issue of economic security as well in Europe. Crucial that we advance with economic security, because otherwise we remain vulnerable to coercion from players outside our borders.
But is Europe meaningfully implementing the Draghi agenda, or is it just talking about it?
Well, no, I think that we are meaningfully advancing with it. From the simplification agenda all the way to energy union, there are steps that the European Union is taking to advance with that. But Europe is slow. It's not just one country that is taking decisions. It is 27 different countries, and of course, coordinated action at the European level. So that, of course, delays progress, and that has always been the problem of the European Union. It is true that we are not advancing at the speed that we ought to be advancing, but there you are.
Well, yeah, when it comes to common European debt, without the political will there to make that case, is it going to take an existential crisis to get it over the line?
It usually does take existential crisis to make advancements in Europe, and that is very unfortunate, but we have done it when we had to. The issue of debt, the case for a common European debt, has never been stronger, given the urgency of implementing investments on European public goods. However, again, we are very slow to advance in this regard. I would be watching the discussions on the next European budget, the multi-annual financing framework, the MFF. President Costa is visiting European countries to try and push over the line to agree on a rather ambitious new budget. That is not common debt, but it is in the right direction in terms of financing European public goods, and hopefully the first step to greater spending at the European level when it comes to the urgent problems.
I wonder if you've seen the IFO numbers this morning. Germany's business outlook actually improving for a fourth month. You've got a boost from public spending. What's your read on the general health of Europe's economy at the moment, given all of the heat waves, the Freudian slip there, the tailwinds that the headwinds that we're seeing at the moment, the heat waves, the wars, tariffs as well?
Well, I mean, despite all this, as you say, huge shocks from climate all the way down to wars, the European economy remains actually resilient. We've seen it also on the inflation side, but also on the growth side. Admittedly, growth in Europe is rather weak, but we have seen that the European economy has managed to deal with the volatility of it all, which means that we are doing the right things to try and preserve some stability in our economies, which is good. It's great to see the German economy that actually suffers to do well for a number of months now, which means that the implementation of investments and the huge commitment to investment is beginning to show some positive news. So I think I will be watching to see whether this is sustained, and if the German economy is moving, that of course takes the European economy with it. So on the whole, I think stability is good news, and let's see the fruits of some of the investments that we've already committed to.
But how worried are you about European gas?
无法练功又很难打得赢战斗的卡关窘境，所以想要顺利进行游戏的话，一定要花点时间练功。幸好这游戏的等级不算难练。值得一提的是 ，Arcane 手把背后有个连发开关，开启后就有连发功能，于是我可以按住按钮连发来自动战斗，大幅增进了练功效率。这点好笑，毕竟连发功能通常是用在动作或射击游戏上，结果《邪恶之子》这款 RPG 反而是我唯一用上这功能的 Arcane 游戏。说实在的，《邪恶之子》的卖相虽然不是很好，瑕疵也不少，但也有让人感受到用心的地方。放宽标准来看的话，是一款做得还不错的游戏。只要不讨厌 RPG， 基本上可以列为 Arcane 的顶级作品。音速飞龙是一款横向卷轴的动作游戏，一言以蔽之，就是款音速小子的拙劣模仿作。游戏一样是以高速移动作为卖点，还有各种一眼就可以看出人点的地形与机关设计，冲刺动作的仿效也是再明显不过，甚至就连关卡的主题设计风格都是比照音速小子来设计。玩起来的差异当然是有的。首先，游戏的主角是以球棒作为攻击手段，从球棒挥击时的图像来看，如果这方面是在模仿初级飞龙，那么音速飞龙这个游戏标准还真是毫不避讳。但既然是要额外做这个动作才能攻击，也就没办法像音速小子那样，可以在移动的同时兼具攻击能力。音速飞龙是可以一边移动一边挥击球棒，但由于攻击效果不具持续性，又有些许时间差，在高速移动时，如果看到敌人才挥棒，通常已经来不及了。音速飞龙另一个跟音速小子之间的明显差异，就是游戏摄影机的取景距离较近，也就是物件在画面上比例较大，造成视野太过狭窄的问题。对于这种移动速度较快、地形变化较多的游戏来说，可是相当严重的致命伤，会使得玩家没有足够的时间反应游戏的变化。在本游戏中，玩家所要收集的主要物品是棒球，它的功用就相当于音速小子中的金块。不过不知道是技术力不足做不出这种效果，还是怎么样，受到攻击时不会全部撒出来，只会固定减少10个棒球。这虽然增加了游戏的稳妥度，但也少了回收失去了精华大的乐趣。关卡设计方面，个人觉得基本上是乏善可陈，没什么让人觉得有趣或爽快的地方。绝大多数的机关与关卡安排只是让玩家感到厌恶也不知所以。即使熟悉关卡配置后，这种感觉会减轻一些，但还是很难说这就有乐趣。另外，游戏内每个场景就只有一关，不像音速小子还会区分2至3个小关，整个游戏全部就只有少少的6关。这次比较音速小子，本游戏在通过检查点时可以进入特殊关卡，但就只是单纯的在时间限制内收集棒球而已，没有收集数量的挑战，当然也没有混沌翡翠，玩起来同样不怎么有趣。如果不跟音速小子相比的话，或许这游戏还不算真的那么差，但摆明模仿却又速度做的比人糟，知道人怎么忽视这些缺点呢？有些游戏设计者会自以为在一些地方做点改变就不算是完全抄袭，甚至宣称这是具有差异化的特色。但很多时候，一款游戏之所以好玩，往往就在于整体设计思维上的一致性与连贯性。片段性模仿他人的设计，却无法抓到整体的设计思维，就是多数模仿作难以媲美原作的关键。这样说的话，这游戏也不是一无可取啊，至少就性能展示方面，它是少数展现了 Arcane 多重高速卷轴能力的游戏。
Okay, cooperation, not escalation. Clear message from you there, Maria.
Indeed.
That's Maria de Mertzis, Economic Policy Professor at the European University Institute. Thank you very much, as always, for joining us. Well, the Volkswagen CEO Oliver Blume will be presenting his restructuring plan to workers at the company's giant Wolfsburg factory later on today. The proposals could wipe out as many as 100,000 jobs. Joining us now for more is Will Wilkes, our automotives reporter out of Frankfurt. So, Will, what exactly is the CEO trying to achieve with this restructuring then? And why is is the pressure on Volkswagen just so intense right now? Remind us.
Good morning, Lizzie. So what he's trying to achieve with this restructuring plan is to get Volkswagen's operating margin from just below 4%, where it is now, to kind of between 8 to 10%. And that's, he thinks, is necessary to make it still an investable company while it's tackling the shift to electrification and the shift to cars as kind of rolling computers, both of which technology shifts require huge investment. And the reason it's becoming more urgent is because Volkswagen's being hit left, right, and centre by different problems that are also hitting other automakers, like the decline in the China market, fierce competition from Chinese manufacturers in Europe, as well as the lingering impact of US tariffs. So Bloom is trying to push ahead with this restructuring package, which the unions say is not necessary, and they say the geopolitical environment makes his targets. The head of the IG Metal Workers Union last week said those were cloud cuckoo land assumptions that Volkswagen can get to margins between 8 to 10%.
Well, how much power actually does the Labour side of the argument have to block his plans?
Actually, different to lots of companies, even in Germany, the Labour side is able to effectively block the plans. Under German corporate law, supervisory boards need to sign off on major strategic decisions like a package like this. Also, by German corporate law, supervisory boards are made up of 50% seats to Labour. In Volkswagen's special case, the German state of Lower Saxony, where several major Volkswagen plants are located, also has a vote. So if Lower Saxony groups together with the unions, they're able to block job losses and plant closures. And I met with the Minister-President of Lower Saxony last night in Hanover, and he was saying we can't accept work closures without any future plans for them, and we can't accept compulsory job losses. So it's stuck, and Bloom needs to try and get these two factions to back his plan. And from the way things look with the meeting next week, that looks very difficult indeed.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on the VW shares throughout the day then. Will, thank you for the update. That's Bloomberg's Will Wilkes. Now let's come to the UK, because a property company owned by Britain's richest aristocrats warning that rising temperatures and planning regulations are threatening the appeal of its properties in London's Mayfair and Belgravia. The Grosvenor Group wants the government to relax planning requirements to allow for basic cooling features. We all like some of those. Joining us now for more is Olivia Rudgard, our climate reporter. So, Olivia, this is a sore spot for many of us living in beautiful listed properties with no aircon. What's stopping older properties getting these features that do something good, keep residents cool?
Yeah, so especially if you live in a listed building, there are some pretty strict restrictions on what you can do to anything that affects that building, actually inside and out, but especially on the outside. So things like air conditioning are really difficult. What Grosvenor actually wants to allow or encourage is more like passive features, so things like shutters and shading. And those also, you might think they'd be easier to get, but they also require permission if you have a listed building, and actually even if you don't, you may well need to apply for planning permission from the local council if you live in a much more ordinary building. So there are these layers of bureaucracy that you sort of have to get through, and it can cost several £100s and take quite a few weeks to obtain.
Okay, so it's not just that we're used to cooler climes, it's also that we're trying to protect the integrity of these buildings. So how might this affect property values in London? Let's say that this is the new normal, that summers just get hotter and hotter and hotter. If we can't have aircon, what does it do to prices?
Yeah, so I think what Grosvenor is really saying is that these buildings, they'll be maintained and looked after if they're lived in, if they're up to date, if there's something that's practical and actually being used. And buildings fall into disrepair when they are being neglected because they're just not up to date. And so what they want to be able to do, both in terms of keeping them warm in the winter, so adding insulation, double glazing, things like that, and then also being able to keep them cool in the summer, is keep those buildings in use. And then the idea is that stops them from falling into disrepair, and then that could affect their values as well.
Okay. I, for one, think it's all a ploy to get us to the office for longer hours to make the use of the aircon. Olivia, thank you very much. That's Olivia Rudgard, our climate reporter. Well, coming up on The Pulse, we'll be looking ahead to NVIDIA's earnings with Adrian Cox of Deutsche Bank Research. That conversation next. This is Bloomberg.
weekday, Bloomberg puts the spotlight on a different aspect of global finance. Flows, funds, and the forces shaping markets on ETF IQ. The future of money with Bloomberg Crypto. The players behind major transactions on Bloomberg Deals. Rates, risk, and the cost of capital on Bloomberg Real Yield. And personal finance, retirement, and wealth management on Bloomberg Money. A different topic every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. When news breaks,
A redhead across the Bloomberg terminal.
Bloomberg has you covered.
Trump's global tariffs are struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court.
For all the context and clarity you need,
There's going to be now tons of tariff headlines until midterm elections.
hear it first on Bloomberg.
Good morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Lizzie Burden in London, and these are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia, we'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart Europe's trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in to Daybreak Europe, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything. This week, Bloomberg is live at the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium. Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, along with Michael McKee, will bring you news and interviews with Fed leaders, policymakers, and economists shaping global monetary policy. Tune in for continuing coverage and a special episode of Surveillance, August 28th at 9 a.m., including full coverage of Kevin Warsh's first speech to the conference. The Jackson Hole Economic Symposium on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
This is The Pulse. I'm Lizzie Burden in London. Now, Nvidia shares have posted their longest losing streak since 2022 amid a global sell-off in chip stocks. The chip giant's earnings tomorrow will be a key test of confidence in the AI trade. And joining us now to discuss the wider tech sector is Adrian Cox, thematic strategist at Deutsche Bank Research. Adrian, great to have you around the desk this morning. So we're reporting that Nvidia's earnings will be showing likely a doubling in data center revenue from a year ago. Just generally, when it comes to the tech space, expectations are so high right now. Is there anything that the likes of Nvidia can report that could impress a market like this?
It's very difficult at the moment to impress anyone.
Yeah.
And we've obviously seen this in the last few days with Nvidia falling by, about 7.5% in the last 7 trading days. So evidently the market is looking at these infrastructure stocks, the picks and shovels, which have really outperformed everyone else over the time since ChatGPT was launched, and trying to find where the edge is. And it's not clear whether they can still maintain that. Obviously, what is going to be key for Nvidia and other stocks is going to be, number one, the guidance. Number two, is there going to be evidence of a kind of swapping from one supplier to another? So instead of Nvidia, it might be some of the other chip producers making ASICs, for example, their own sort of custom chips. And also the implications of things like export controls and whether that's going to perhaps damp the sales going forward.
Okay, but we report that some of Nvidia's biggest customers have been told the prices of its AI servers are going up more than 15%. Now, in your notes, you've written that cheaper AI will likely boost spending. So this is the opposite. Is that sort of tactic by the likes of Nvidia actually not very wise right now?
Well, really, I think what's going on, if you just take a step back, is this distinction that's going on in the sort of format wars between the open source models on the one hand and the proprietary models on the other. And what the open source models have shown over the course of the summer is that you can really perform most of what you need to perform at a very much cheaper rate than is being performed by the proprietary models. So if you have the biggest proprietary model at the moment, then it's going to cost you or sort of the open source kind of equivalent for something which is more or less the same is going to be about a quarter of the price if you're using a Chinese open source model. If you want to use something where you can just take a little step down in quality, you can get something for maybe a tenth of the price. And so I think the bigger picture that we're seeing is this kind of shift where there are more models out there available, and therefore it gives the chance for producers like Nvidia to sell more AI, even if that is to the disadvantage of one or two of the proprietary model makers.
Yeah, because you've got OpenAI building its own chip, Anthropic building its own chip. Meta signing deals with seemingly everyone. Amazon saying that its in-house chip business would generate $25 billion in revenue as a standalone. When you've got the hyperscaler chip arms race going on like that, how does it hurt the likes of Nvidia?
Obviously, every new competitor is going to be good for the market, I guess, because that means that consumers have choice of who they can refer to. One of the most important things really about open source actually is that it's not just a cost play and a sort of an opportunity for consumers, enterprises to choose which model they want to use, but it also means that there's more competition out there, which means that there's competition not just for the models, which are the kind of commodity side of things, but also actually more up and down the stack, because there's less kind of lock-in for a specific chip.
Okay, and then also if we talk about CapEx, you've got Nvidia becoming the bank of last resort effectively for the AI trade overall. Do you look at that web of CapEx, and Bloomberg's got some fantastic maps of this on the terminal. Do you look at it and think it's just trying to do too much, it's all too dangerous?
Well, I think at the moment we're still really looking at very, very strong demand. So by some forecasts, there's at least another 4 or 5 years before current demand will actually be matched by supply. So even though obviously there is going to be quite legitimate examination of the kind of funding structures that all of the different hyperscalers and the model providers and everyone else are engaging in, and questions about the opacity of that, the bigger issue is the fact that really there's just no stopping this demand. And until demand begins to dry up, then all questions about, the sort of the short to medium term sustainability of the financing are somewhat moot.
So these levels of investment continue for 4 or 5 years?
It looks like it, yeah. I mean, if you imagine that maybe only 20-30% of companies are really using AI, and very often those are mainly just kind of pilots at the moment, just imagine all of those companies using AI more extensively and more companies overall using AI extensively. That gives you an enormous runway for greater demand to grow.
And how do you think about the threat from Chinese AI?
Well, China's been playing a really interesting role in all of this, and I think obviously we had the DeepSeek moment at the beginning of last year. If you look at what's happening in EVs, actually, it's quite an interesting analogy. So EVs now, about 75% of global production is Chinese, about 5% is American. So the Chinese overtook the US in about 2015 and have been growing very fast ever since. And in a way, this should be a wake-up call for the US that shows that just because you have the kind of the start of the technology doesn't mean that you can necessarily expect to continue that. And in the case of the Chinese, they took a disadvantage, which was not really being able to compete on the internal combustion engine, but having very strong capabilities around batteries, and then turning that into a successful model around cars. And I think we're potentially seeing the same limitations being the mother of invention on open source models too.
Just because you're the first doesn't mean you'll always be the best.
Absolutely not. And you really see this actually in the history of AI, where one not only model, but also kind of model has just overtaken another over the last few years.
It's a really interesting comparison. Adrian, thank you for joining us this morning. That's Adrian Cox, thematic strategist at Deutsche Bank Research. Well, before we wrap up the hour, let's just check back in on these markets. And we are looking at Nasdaq futures up now 0.6%. They've got the wind in their sails this morning. The dollar is steady against its major peers. Brent is now weaker by 2% at $90 a barrel. And Bitcoin is shy of the 80K level it had surpassed earlier. But coming up this evening, we'll be hearing from the Premier of Canada's Ontario province, Doug Ford. We talked about him earlier. He's found himself at the centre of a war of words with President Trump. So that coming up on Balance of Power at 10 p.m. London time. We'll pass you to the brief now. This is Bloomberg.
Investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Ahmed, only on Bloomberg. Today, Wayfair sees immense potential in brick-and-mortar stores.
He asked you specifically, when we got into physical retail, our view was that, even if the market
market continued to grow for e-commerce, probably a large chunk of the market in this space would stay offline.
Kate Gulliver showed me around Wayfair's new 150,000 square foot
Tobacco notes.
flagship store.
When customers who have seen us online come into the store, they're generally a bit surprised by actually the breadth of what we offer. Often if you're going online, maybe you're looking for something particular. But when you come into the store, you walk in, you see the market square, you see all these pillows, you see the decorative accents. So what we're seeing actually is that in store, we do really well in some categories that online are, less a percentage of the total.
How does technology help in kind of making it seamless online to store
I think
and vice versa?
The biggest thing is for the customer on the front end, that she can be in the store, that she can actually shop here, go back home, complete that purchase. And if you look at these sort of price tags and everything, they're all these digital tags. It's because they're the exact same prices they are online. So you're not going to be surprised that you saw something in the store and then you decided to purchase it online, that it's somehow different and that the offering is different. It's actually very consistent. But when she's here, she can have her app open and everything that she's doing here can be very similar to what she's doing at home. And I think that consistency is quite important.
Technology is embedded in every aspect of our lives, and that revolution is playing out in real time. From finance to defense tech, AI to entertainment, from the road to the stars, Bloomberg is bringing you the stories of companies and people that are pushing tech to new frontiers and the politics reshaping global tech markets. I'm Ed Ludlow, live in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Tech. Every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television.
At a time when policy in Washington is driving Wall Street, we draw a distinction between the rhetoric and the action, bringing you market-moving guests and original reporting. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
It's 5 a.m. in New York City, 10 a.m. in London. Good morning, I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Let's get you set up for the day. A risk for Sino-US relations. China defends its cooperation with Iran and warns against any disruption after the US threatened Tehran's economic partners. Another response to Washington's trade pressure. Canada set to announce a range of measures to protect its citizens from 50% US tariffs on certain goods. And growing criticism of Secretary Scott Bessent's bond buying plans as mentor Stanley Druckenmiller publicly now calling it a mistake. Let's get a check on markets around the world. First off, Winnie Su is in Hong Kong for us. Winnie.
Yeah, good morning, Bonnie. Well, we did see Asian stocks fluctuating quite a bit today. Now the benchmark is trading in the green after erasing some of its earlier losses. It does seem like a bit of a calm before the storm, if I could say. We are still closely monitoring those moves in terms of the Iran sanctions as well as the trade tensions between the US and Canada as well as US and China. Well, we do see oil prices coming back down a bit, so perhaps that is also helping the overall rebound in the regional stocks, especially with Kospi index here trading ended in the green after having reversed as much as 4.3% of losses earlier today. Now, flip the board, you take a look at one market that actually is still trading in the red and under some pressure, which is a Chinese market. We are seeing both offshore and onshore stocks in the red, and that is coming as the tech stocks still facing some pressure. When it comes to XPeng, it is down about 10%. We did see earnings missing estimate for both second quarter earnings as well as the third quarter outlook. So that overall weighing on tech stocks in Hong Kong, with the gauge now trading at its lowest level in 7 weeks.
All right, a difficult week for tech stocks. Winnie, thank you so much. That's Winnie Su in Hong Kong. Europe, meanwhile, is choosing to look on the bright side. So we have the general stocks Europe 600 index up about 1/3% now. Broadly positive across the board. In London, we have FTSE 100 up about 1/10%. This is mainly on lower oil prices, which we've been seeing now for a couple of days after oil hit a 2-week high. And then the euro, pretty stable right now, 116.68 versus the US dollar. It has been strengthening, though, all month as this debasement trade takes hold. So we do want to keep an eye on that. But let's move to the United States, because we've seen several days of declines for chip stocks. Yesterday, we were down more than 2.5% on the stocks. The NASDAQ end of the day down 1%. And we've been seeing days and days, 7 consecutive of them, of lower prices for NVIDIA before earnings tomorrow. That's one of the catalysts for this week's trade. Before that, we are seeing a little bit of a rebound today for Nasdaq 100 futures. Not as much for S&P and for Russell 2000, which have been lagging the Nasdaq in the session, but we are seeing those in the green. So we'll see what Nvidia has to say. And then, of course, at the end of the week, we have Jackson Hole. And we have markets continuing to respond to the Treasury's moves. Now, to that point, today we have the most public excoriation that we've got yet of Scott Bessent's plans. Stanley Druckenmiller, noted billionaire hedge fund trader for decades now, worked with Soros and Bessent and has been very involved in sovereign markets and, of course, in FX markets, coming out and saying this is a mistake. The 30-year yield and that bond market is the only fiscal disciplinarian left that we have. And he has put all of his thoughts into the Wall Street Journal. Very unusual move for Stanley Druckenmiller, usually fairly private. So we have the 30-year yield, though, down about 3 basis points today. And as you can see, crude lower, gold just off a touch, but it's still high up there. And Bitcoin very near 80,000, which it did top. 82,800 and change is the next level that we are looking at. All right, let's get to some individual market movers now. For that, we'll go across to London and Chloe Melly.
Good morning, Bonnie. We're seeing chip stocks rebounding, finding a bit of a steadier footing ahead of those Nvidia earnings. Of course, Nvidia being this bellwether for the AI trade, and it seems that there is some enthusiasm in that sector ahead of those very important earnings. So very much green across the board there. Moving on to Dick's Sporting Goods, which is also in focus this morning ahead of the earnings, and investors are really looking for signs that the turnaround for Foot Locker is working, and it seems that there is some cautious optimism ahead of those earnings this morning. We're up just slightly in the green. And finally, over in London, Melrose Industries had some issue back in May with a manufacturing facility closing. Now it is saying that the operations will resume by the end of September, and clarified some of the costs around that closure, and that is really driving the stock this morning, reassuring investors, and we're up about 9% here in the UK.
All right, that is the top performer in the FTSE. Chloe, thank you so much. Chloe Melly there. Coming up, we're going to be speaking with Henry Allen of Deutsche Bank on what he's calling an unstable market equilibrium. Washington's latest plans to isolate Iran's economy hitting dozens of businesses in China and Hong Kong, putting potential further consequences in the spotlight. Beijing is Iran's main trading partner and the buyer of 90% of its oil. China earlier reiterating its opposition to the sanctions placed on dozens of Hong Kong and China-based entities. None of its major financial institutions, at least as of yet. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Jill Desus in Hong Kong. So the Foreign Ministry a couple of hours ago, Jill, basically saying we're doing all of what we do with Iran in coordination with international norms. There's nothing wrong with this. We're going to continue to do so. That's a pretty strong response. Would it suggest that there's more to come if there are more sanctions placed on China institutions?
Yeah, look, Bonnie, I think at this point, we're still really waiting to see whether or not there's a really big hit here. I mean, you did have that language coming out of China's foreign ministry. I will say a lot of that is sort of reiterating things that we've heard from China before. So obviously, they stand at the ready for any kind of a retaliation. But I mean, let's take a look at what Scott Bessent actually announced, right? You've got, sanctions on these dozens of firms in China and Hong Kong, but you're looking at a lot of sort of smaller firms, the tech procurement kinds of, aspects. I think, when we're talking about what would really, really hit China, what would be a really, really aggressive move, despite, I will say, some pretty strong language coming from the U.S. Treasury Secretary here, I think what you'd have to see is, sanctions on maybe a really large Chinese bank. We did hear some hints from Scott Bessent. He was pretty vague. He didn't mention anyone by name, that maybe there is something more potentially coming. But I think that kind of sanction or other types of secondary sanctions on China that would really hit them, when it comes to, that oil trade in particular. I mean, that I think is maybe a little bit too far of a bridge for Washington to cross here. But I do think that at this point, a lot of the response that we've seen from the United States at this point is still fairly mild compared to, the full toolbox here. It's still a big question as to whether or not Washington would actually want to go that far, though.
Well, and we know that China can create substitute entities pretty quickly for sanctioned entities if it needs to, right? But that wouldn't be the case if a major financial institution were to be sanctioned. Now, Scott Bessent has threatened it. China is obviously saying, don't undermine our relations with Iran, so it's not going to do anything proactively. Is Bessent boxing himself into a corner here? Will he have to sanction some kind of major China institution?
I mean, you've certainly heard a lot of rhetoric from the United States. You know that Donald Trump himself is very frustrated with how long this war has gone on and is looking for ways to inflict more economic pain on Tehran specifically. I do think, though, that the limiting factor when it comes to China is the fact that we've got this upcoming summit between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump that's supposed to be happening in Washington, D.C. in just about a month's time. And I mean, there's a lot of questions over how much, the United States would actually want to jeopardize that meeting, this relationship between the world's two economic superpowers. You've got, a lot of questions over the status of maybe the trade truce between the United States and China, which was signed, just under about a year ago. You've got all of these sort of considerations going into this meeting in Washington, D.C. next month. I mean, does the United States actually want to jeopardize a lot of that? I think that's a really, really valuable question here to ask. But at the same time, if you're the United States, if you're Donald Trump, you want this war to end before the U.S. midterms in November. It's becoming deeply unpopular with the United States, the American public. It puts the United States in really a bind here.
Well, to your point there, Jill, that one-year trade truce is set to expire November 10th. And we're also hearing reporting that the US is set to impose a 7.5% tariff on Chinese goods. This is the 301 tariffs. We're waiting on results from the investigation, but they should come soon-ish. Is this all leverage before the Trump-Xi summit?
Yeah, I think, this is an interesting one. So this is, people familiar with the matter telling us that they're looking at imposing the 7.5% tariff as it relates to some of their concerns over China, over capacity of manufacturing. This is related to, again, as you mentioned, those Section 301 tariffs. I think this is really part of the Trump administration trying to rebuild elements of its tariff regime that was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. I think if you were to look at the calculations in terms of what's being considered here, we're not really looking at an implementation of tariffs that would be above, a threshold acceptable to Beijing, at least when it comes to upholding the status of that trade truce. So we'll see what ultimately happens there, whether it's some posturing ahead of that summit. But I'm not sure that it's going to move the needle substantially at this point.
All right, Jill, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Jill Deeses for us in Hong Kong. Here in the Americas, Canada is set to announce a range of measures to protect its workers and businesses in response to 50% US tariffs on $20 billion of Canada's annual exports. A press conference expected at around 11 a.m. New York time. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Brendan Murray. So we're supposed to hear what Canada is going to do for its own citizens. Brendan, will there be any repercussions for US citizens in what's announced today?
Yeah, it sounds like what we're going to get are things like additional jobless benefits and support, maybe loan support for businesses to help them weather this trade storm that Canadian businesses are about to go through. But what we've really seen over the past 24 hours is a real uptick in the rhetoric and the tone and the trust level between Ottawa and Washington. This is the result of the breakdown in the talks that headed into the weekend, and so we've seen President Trump and Prime Minister Carney lob insults at each other, and this really isn't an environment that's conducive for both sides coming back to the negotiating table anytime soon. That said, the amount of economic activity that's hit by these tariffs is still relatively small. The escalatory talk would hit more economic activity, but at the moment we're really just in a war of words rather than one where supply chains would be severely impacted by tariffs on a broad scale.
So, according to our reporting, Howard Lutnick really collapsed the talks sort of last minute. He was unhappy with any deal for metals producers. But what does this change for those producers, Brendan?
Yeah, what we have inside the administration are the hawks and the advisors who are not so hawkish about the whole reshoring issue. And as you've mentioned, we're coming up on 2 months before the midterms, and there are some key battleground states where members of Congress on the Republican side don't want to lose those seats. And so what they're trying to appeal to here is that the administration is bringing jobs home, reshoring production, and the White House is looking at those production lines in Canada and saying, Canada's got something that we want, and we are going to to put tariffs on Canadian imports until those incentives realign for auto manufacturers to make cars in the U.S. and trucks. So what we're seeing is part economic posturing and part political posturing. Right now, Canada thinks it's got some leverage on President Trump because a trade war against Canada is not as popular as a trade war against China, and we'll see how that plays out in some of the border states in the weeks ahead.
To your point about it being a political situation as well, Trump basically endorsing somebody for the Oklahoma's governor's race, using the planned aluminum plant there as leverage really for his endorsement. That's the thing, though. Are there aluminum plants planned all over the country, Brendan? Or how are we supposed to come up with the aluminum if there isn't enough aluminum in the US?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the investment pledges have been made in some cases, but it takes years to build these kind of facilities, and it takes a lot of power. And that's why Canada has the big aluminum capacity, is because of the hydropower that it provides. And so these are things that are not going to be resolved with some tariff threats over the next few months. But ultimately, the Trump administration is trying to make this case that they are pressuring the U.S.'s main trading partners with tariffs to try to reshore some of those national security related industries that they're trying to bring back to the U.S.
All right, Brendan, thank you so much. We'll hear more at 11 a.m. at that news conference. That is Brendan Murray, our trade czar. Now to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. Stanley Druckenmiller calling Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's plan to suspend billions buying back U.S. bonds a mistake. In a Wall Street Journal op-ed, Druckenmiller argues that policymakers should let the market do its job and said governments defending prices against fundamentals always lose. Druckenmiller mentored Treasury Secretary Bessent in his early career as a hedge fund trader. Volkswagen Labour representatives warned that the automaker's planned cuts could eventually affect as many as 140,000 jobs. Management has outlined cuts that could eliminate as many as 100,000 positions. Union officials say another 40,000 could go if certain factories close. Volkswagen CEO Oliver Blume is taking his restructuring pitch to workers at the company's main factory today. Bitcoin has climbed above 80,000 for the first time since mid-May, extending that sharp rebound. The cryptocurrency rallied more than 23% last week, its biggest weekly rally in about 3 years. Coming up, a deep dive on how the closure of the Strait of Hormuz could reshape supply chains and energy markets. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Lizzie Burden in London, and these are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. markets close to the overnight session in Asia, we'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart Europe's trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in to Daybreak Europe, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. And we're here, where the action starts in Sydney and in Tokyo. Get ahead as the global trading day begins. The Asia Trade, weekdays only on Bloomberg.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Haslinda Amin in Mumbai. This is Bloomberg.
It's the world's second largest economy, with a growing influence in global affairs. Bloomberg Bloomberg The China Show brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China.
We need to do more to engage the market more. We are risk on. I think we caught a little sweet spot.
Massive savings right now.
It's already a different game.
Bloomberg The China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Full-fledged balls-to-the-wall horror games that still somehow feel calming, which, when you start to think about it, makes absolutely no sense.
This week, Bloomberg is live at the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium. Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, along with Michael McKee, will bring you news and interviews with Fed leaders, policymakers, and economists shaping global monetary policy. Tune in for continuing coverage and a special episode of Surveillance, August 28th at 9 a.m., including full coverage of Kevin Warsh's first speech to the conference. The Jackson Hole Economic Symposium on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz during the war with Iran has exposed the risks of countries and economies relying on one of the world's most important energy choke points. However, the market has proved more resilient than many expected. Bloomberg Intelligence examines how the world has adapted and whether it marks a turning point for global supply chains. Will Hayers of Bloomberg Intelligence joins us now for more. So, Will, have we seen peak Hormuz now?
So peak Hormuz we are viewing in the terms of dependence on Hormuz. We are seeing a very quick movement and adjustments from the Gulf states and companies to diversify and de-risk from the strait. And this is coming primarily via pipeline expansions, storage facilities, and new port construction in and around the strait and to bypass the dangerous waterway now.
Is it still necessary? I mean, all these choke points that we have around the world, and now we're finding ways around them. The UAE has a workaround, and Aramco is now operating a pipeline running across Saudi Arabia. If there were the possibilities for those before, then why did it take so long?
Well, so it's really a system of de-risking. So we're looking at a multifaceted approach to reducing the risk of that waterway. We're seeing some of that being within the strait itself. The U.S. Navy is conducting some convoy escorts to varying success. We have seen reports of up to 10 million barrels per day being achieved from some U.S. government officials. We think that's probably a bit lower, but it will really be a multifaceted approach from pipelines, from some vessels transit, from some demand destruction, and a little bit of production increases outside of the Gulf.
We're basically pretty much through the quarter for the energy majors. What would you say would be a good summary of their comments about Hormuz, the state of Hormuz, and is there a consensus on strategy for dealing with it?
So the consensus from 2Q comments from the European energy majors was that they expect a intermittent Hormuz transits moving forward, and we think this is a pretty reasonable approach. It's not going to be anywhere close to where we were pre-war at 20 million barrels per day. We think somewhere around 5 million barrels per day. You might have some days that it pops up a little bit more, but their approach is going to be one of diligence and resiliency and discipline. They have removed all 3Q operational guidance from the Gulf. However, they're still doing very well in this environment. The operational impact that they sustained, this is Shell, BP, Total, really pales in comparison to the commodity price capture that they saw in 2Q, the trading gains that they made, which are very high, and of course the extraordinary refining margins that are flowing from the disruption of the downstream facilities within the Gulf.
All right, well, it is a fantastic report from Bloomberg Intelligence. I would urge everybody to read it, the current state of play, how Gulf countries have been adapting, increasing bypass capacity and so on to the Strait of Hormuz. That is Will Hayers of Bloomberg Intelligence. Coming up, UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham planning for a trip to Washington. A look at what's making headlines in your front page news next. This is Bloomberg.
most successful economies in the region. The key to their success is continuity. But the way our constitution is written, it actually encourages a lack of continuity. And that's a problem. The term for local government is 3 years when I first became congressman. It takes you a few months to learn the business and to make your connections, to network, etc. If, for example, you are not particularly favored in the majority, passing a law in a year and a half is not that easy to do. After about a year and a half, you already hear that there's somebody in your district beginning to campaign and is going to oppose you in the next election. So you have to go back to your district to take care of that. And how much work do you get done?
Middle East and Africa. Vibrant resources and high-yield investment opportunities abound. Join me on Horizons Middle East and Africa for the stories, newsmakers, and insight from this exciting region. Now weekdays, only on Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Time now for your front page news. First up, the Financial Times reporting U.S. grain farmers in the Corn Belt are facing their worst crisis in 40 years as the Iran war sends costs of inputs from diesel to fertilizer spiraling. Heartland farmers already struggling after years of low grain prices. This pain all coming ahead of midterms that will determine control of Congress. Next up, the Washington Post on the Supreme Court easing a path for an executive order from President Trump that would impose sweeping new restrictions on mail-in balloting. The Post says it could inject fresh uncertainty into the already high-stakes midterms. The case now returns to the lower courts. And Bloomberg reporting UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham plans to travel to the US next month to lobby President Trump to let Ukraine access some of its Patriot air defense missile stocks ahead of winter. Burnham told Bloomberg that European leaders are considering holding another coalition of the willing meeting around the UN General Assembly. Let's take a look at markets. We are seeing Nasdaq futures pointed higher, the 30-year yield lower, but more criticism today from Stanley Druckenmiller, no less, in the Wall Street Journal of Scott Bessent's plans. Gold holding on to gains for the most part, but just off its highs. All right, coming up, we're going to speak about all this to Henry Allen of Deutsche Bank.
Do you mind being called an ideological lunatic or a bunch of left-wing nut jobs?
I've been called worse things than that.
You'd think she owned the place.
23andMe, I think, is so incredibly valuable. We're coming back.
It had that kind of detective story feel to it. You know, when you're hot on the trail of something, you know that it's very exciting. What magazines were you reading as a kid?
小小年纪，松开我的手，迷失的你，在人群里看见你，一边哭泣，手还握着冰淇淋。有时候难过生气，你总有办法逗我开心，依然清晰回忆里那些曾经就像流泪的光阴。我们的生命先后顺序在同个温室里，也是存在在这个世界唯一的唯一。未来的每一步与脚印，踏着彼此梦想前进，路上偶尔风吹雨淋，也要握紧你的手心。未来的每一步与脚印，相知相惜相依为命，别忘记之间的约定，我会永远在你身边陪着你。还记得小小年纪，松开我的手，迷失的你，在人群里看见你，一边哭泣，手还握着冰淇淋。有时候难过生气，你总有办法逗我开心，依然清晰回忆里那些曾经，就像流泪的光阴。我们的生命先后顺序在同个温室里，也是存在在这个世界唯一的唯一。未来的每一步与脚印，踏着彼此梦想前进，路上偶尔风吹雨淋，也要握紧你。
Which is where everybody will be looking before we get Fed Chair Warsh's comments at Jackson Hole. It's at 422 and change. Now, we're also getting some positive sentiment feed through from crude prices being lower, down about 3%. Even Brent is below $90. But gold is still up there, above $4,600. And Bitcoin topped $80,000 as this potentially debasement trade continues. Let's get to some individual market movers now with Chloe Melly.
Good morning, Bonnie. It is green across the screen for those chip stocks after some recent weakness. This is ahead of those Nvidia earnings, of course, very important given that the company really is a bellwether for this AI trade. And it seems that there is some optimism, some enthusiasm there around this AI sector. And we are seeing the likes of Intel, Micron, and AMD also quite firmly in the green this morning. Moving on to Dick's Sporting Goods, which is also in focus ahead of earnings today. We had seen the shares slightly up. Now they are slightly down. The real focus for investors is going to be around the turnaround for Foot Locker. So there seems to be a little bit of uncertainty around what the company is going to report. And finally, let's go over to Poland, where CD Projekt, the video game maker, is down quite significantly this morning. The worst performer on the European benchmark, down about 6% after delaying the release of its latest game, The Witcher 4. And so we are seeing that really weigh on the stock with that delay.
All right, Chloe, thank you so much. Chloe Melly there in London. Billionaire investor and the early mentor of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Stan Druckenmiller, saying his former pupil has made a mistake with his bond buying strategy. Druckenmiller writing in the Wall Street Journal, markets aggregate information no committee possesses, and prices are how that information reaches decision makers. The long-term Treasury yield is the most important price in the world. It is also the only fiscal disciplinarian the US has left. Every basis point of artificial yield suppression is a subsidy to procrastination. Joining us now is Henry Allen, macro strategist at Deutsche Bank. Wow, that is a slap in the face, Henry. Each sentence that I read there, and I would suggest there's even a veiled criticism of the Warsh Fed here too, suggesting that you don't need to tell markets that they need to make up their own mind about the data. Markets are the aggregators of information that tell you what to do. What are we to make of this op-ed today, Henry, and the idea that Scott Bessent's plans are just all wrong?
Well, it's certainly a striking piece, and in terms of what the Treasury have done, clearly there are always risks if you're moving in that kind of direction of almost like financial repression, really. And we've seen, obviously, even as long-term Treasury yields came down, there was a reaction in the price of other assets. We saw, for instance, the dollar depreciate. We saw investors move into gold at the same time as well. So it's clear that investors are concerned about financial repression. But at the same time, to be honest, I don't think you're in a world of debasement. I think that there's been too much of a narrative that there is this debasement trade that's back. But much as gold prices have risen, you're not seeing a reaction in long-term inflation swaps at the same time. If people truly believe that some debasement scenario was on the cards where the Treasury were going to inflate away the debt effectively, you would start to see long-term inflation expectations, particularly at like the 30-year horizon, move higher. That's something we haven't seen at all so far.
And as Bessent himself said, there hasn't been a single bond bought yet, right? This has just been announced. So the whole way this is playing out is really fascinating. If we take a look ahead to Jackson Hole, you're saying that there won't be that much that will come out of Jackson Hole. What would be the best case scenario for the market?
Well, I think the market is kind of craving certainty at the moment in the sense that Walsh has clearly steered away from forward guidance. He's being clear that he thinks there are downsides to that. So we're seeing more volatility introduced whereby we're going into the next meeting with markets, just like in July, very unsure what the Fed are going to do. So that's introduced a regime with higher vol, and we know that more vol on the rate side has traditionally also led to more vol on the equity side as well. So from a market point of view, I think what a lot of people would love is the kind of steer that Powell gave us in the last couple of years, where he implicitly signaled that rate cuts were ahead. But given Walsh's very much, decried forward guidance, said how it locks the Fed into actions that might not be appropriate given later data, I think it's unlikely we're going to get that.
So with that and the core PCE, which we already...
A first playthrough, but eventually. And I've been trying to figure out why that happens. Horror games in general are designed to keep you on edge for long periods, but game designers have figured out that in order for scares to hit harder, they also need to give you moments of peace too. In every game in the genre, there's always a moment where things just kind of stop. There will always be a brief moment where there are no enemies and the music shifts from audio violence to something more calming, even if it's nothing at all. And these are the moments where you finally get to breathe again. I'm not even joking, this made me jump while I was editing it. For me, the best example of this is the dark room in Resident Evil 2. After arriving at the RPD, fighting the Licker and hordes of zombies, you eventually arrive at that door over there, and when you open it and walk in, the entire mood of the game changes. This isn't your first save point, but it is the one that compounds the chill factor. It's brightly lit, the tension disappears, and you'd never know there was an outbreak outside if you only saw this room. And then the music kicks in. And it's not just a bop either, it's literally designed to chill you out. The tempo sits loosely at a resting heart rate, and the intention from the devs was to give you a secure place, which is the name of the song as well, to physically slow back down again. And it really works, because the second you hear that song, you feel safe. Silent Hill does the same thing in a what am I even doing? Silent Hill does the same thing in a totally different way. Where Resi gives you predefined nap time sections between bouts of horror, Silent Hill gives you something more emotional, which is in keeping with the themes in the games. You get hit with songs that couldn't exist in any other game, and they feel more like moments of reflection than relief. Take something like the moment Henry finds Cynthia in Silent Hill 4.
I'll do a special favor for you later.
She's the first person you meet on your trip to the other world. I'm skimming over a lot of lore here, by the way, and if you want like a deep dive on that game, I have got the perfect video for you. When you eventually find her later on wearing what should be on her insides on the outside, the music that plays in the background isn't dramatic or scary, it's somber and emotional. It even has lyrics that reflect the story of the game's main antagonist, Walter Sullivan. Some of the most relaxing music I've ever heard comes from some of the most disturbing games ever made. Like, I genuinely listen to this music outside of the games as well, which is mental when you think that something like True from Silent Hill 2, which is a gorgeous song by the way, plays out after you find out that Big Jim has killed his wife. And this emotional contrast is the whole point. If a horror game's an emotional roller coaster, then these top parts are boss fights, jump scares, chase sequences, and these bottom parts are lo-fi chill beats, a cup of coffee and a pan au chocolat. And by the way, if you scoop up all of the songs from horror games in those little low points, those little troughs, and put them on one playlist, you'll have made an absolute banger of a mixtape. I've linked mine in the description below if you want to check it out. It also serves to create this addictive emotional rhythm. Tension, release, fear, safety, chaos, control, and the safe spaces are where the rhythm resets. It's the admin office in Amnesia the Bunker in between bouts of hiding from an unkillable beast. It's the Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls after cheesing your way through 100 enemies after initially dying 200 times. It's the apartment in Silent Hill 4 after mercilessly beating your worm in the subway until the room gets haunted, because then fuck that. When you've been under threat for an hour, these spaces give you permission to breathe for a sec. They're like small mercies scattered throughout games that are usually devoid of it. Knowing these spaces exist propels you forward through the terrifying parts because you know you'll have somewhere to take a break eventually. And if you can't handle pressing forward, you can always fall back to this one. One thing I should mention is that I don't think any single horror game can be cozy the first time you play it. Anyone who's seen me on stream, and I'm sorry I don't stream that often, it's something I'm trying to work on, let's not get all fussy about it for now, alright? But they should know that my first few hours with any new horror game is just a compilation of me crying, shitting, and farting. Oh, fucking Christ! Not knowing what's around the next corner, not knowing where anything is, I can't see. Not knowing if opening the next door is going to lead to a quiet corridor or to a boss. God. It's what horror games quite often rely on, the fear of the unknown. When you do encounter a new nightmare with a face, or without one, you'll embark on your own little fight or flight journey. Without this becoming some kind of science video, that spike of adrenaline that gets triggered by the stress response of holy balls, what the fuck is that, is what carries you through the game. It's an incredibly addictive loop, and it's also why things like battle royale games and extraction shooters are so insanely popular. But that second playthrough of a horror game is where things change. Because now you know where the enemies are, where the save points are, and which doors you should open along with the ones you absolutely leave the fuck alone. That familiarity doesn't completely remove the fear element, but it does make it a little bit quieter, which gives you some room to be a bit more reflective, even peaceful. Yeah, I'm recording a video. Yeah, that's fine, you're fine. The opening section in Dead Space aboard the Ishimura before everything kicks off stops feeling like a nightmare and feels like somewhere you've been before, because you have. Oh my god, dude, I literally just told you a second ago, man. And we also double down on this when the nostalgia factor comes into play. A lot of these games we would have first picked up when we were younger, and this stuff was a lot scarier, and I'll never forget how overwhelming horror games were to me as a kid. I mean, I've waffled about that enough on this channel. Those first playthroughs back then would have been so much more intense than they are now. I still remember having nightmares and being physically ill because of how scared I was. A friend of mine used to tear out the pictures of horror games from magazines that his parents used to buy him, just because he was scared that the creatures would climb out of it. At night, he'd even put the magazines outside of his bedroom door, just in case. Coming back to them now is like revisiting that version of yourself, but you're not scared anymore, and you can just savor the feeling of who you used to be. I think horror is particularly powerful when it removes control, but having familiarity removes that as a factor. It's kind of like a calming ritual. It's like going back and watching those old episodes of The Simpsons or Always Sunny or something. We've spent so much of our lives in those franchises that going back and playing them lets those feelings that you felt originally wash over you again. Those spaces that used to feel threatening or totally overwhelming now actually feel pretty relaxing. And with the fear lessened, you start to feel more in control. And that is a completely different reason to keep playing. What's funny is that horror games have more in common with cozy games than you might think. Like, how is the Resi 4 inventory screen not a cozy game? You pick this guy up, you put him over there, give this little chap a twist, pop him in there. Very nice, very evil. What I'm getting at is that a big part of horror games is chaos, but within that chaos are these little moments of control. And the more they grow, the less intense the game becomes. It's like that feeling of trying to open 68,000 doors and they're all locked before you finally find a key that unlocks them all. Or when you finally complete a puzzle that initially made zero sense. Or that Metroidvania feeling of when you unlock a shortcut at the end of an area that loops back to the beginning and saves you tons of time and aggro. By the way, I know that some people are going to say that Dark Souls or Elden Ring or Demon Souls aren't horror games, but when you've got an enemy like the Finger Creeper in it, or those crow things from Bloodborne, your argument becomes null and void. All of these are just more ways the game surrenders a bit more control to you. It also exists in careful resource management, which doesn't sound sexy, but the delayed gratification of finally pulling out your Magnum Dong to use on a boss is absolutely unmatched. And when things are chaotic, like tackling an arena full of nightmares, the unbridled joy of running around hoovering up the spoils of war knowing there are no more threats in the area is a fitting reward for the stress. There are very few games that dish out dopamine hits like a horror game does because the stakes in other games are so rarely so stacked against you. There's no better feeling than going from piss your pants scared to I am so over-prepared for this area that I will now laugh in the face of every enemy I meet. One thing I can't overlook is how pivotal a role sound design plays in this whole thing. Silent Hill is the finest example of how much pressure good sound design can put on you. The enemy sounds are gross. The radio static sounds that are made when there's an enemy nearby are absolutely petrifying. And some of the music sounds like a goddamn hate crime. But in between those awful bits, there's an almost ASMR-like quality to it. It's repetitive, predictable, kind of soothing in a strange way. And horror games are full of this stuff. The little tap, tap, tap of a typewriter, the low ambient hum of a room that's completely still, and the loudest footsteps on the entire planet. I would actually gladly add a Claire runs around the RPD hall with no particular objective 4K 60 FPS 10-hour version to my sleep playlist. I'd probably sleep a lot better, actually. One disclaimer, I don't think that every single horror game can be cozy, by the way. I'm not completely insane. I think for horror to be comfortable, it needs to give you a few things. Number one, space. Yes, in a physical sense, distance from the monsters, but more in a psychological way. Like, can I vibe without immediate threat from the monsters that allows me time to have a little mooch around or click on a specific desk 50 times for a secret message? Number two, time. Not literal time, more like freedom from urgency. Time to think about where you need to go next, plan your route, and pause mentally. This one doesn't just apply to safe spaces either. It also applies to bringing up your map or your inventory screen. Can I bring up my map so I know where I'm going next? Or can I bring up my inventory and eat a herb in the middle of a fight? Like, oh, hold on a sec. Oh, I'm really bad. Finally, number three, control. And this is a biggie, but it's a simple one. Can you gain an understanding and influence what's happening? I don't expect all three things at once necessarily, but as long as they can grant you those three wishes over time, like some kind of fucked up zombie genie, it's pretty easy to carve out your own comfy little spot. Some games just straight up don't do that. It's why I could never see Outlast as a cozy game. I said a bunch of times while I played it on stream that it was the most stressful game I've ever played, and I stand by that. It does have its moments where you know you're not going to be attacked, but they look like this. There's never any space to exist in the cramped hallways of the asylum, and the whole game's kind of philosophy is about a complete lack of control. Any game that has your ability to fucking see tied to a battery meter can never be considered cozy in my eyes. Another one that might be a bit more divisive is Silent Hill 2, but let me clarify that a bit. The original Silent Hill 2, sure, yeah, that one's cozy. Massive PS2 era charm and nostalgia, it's not super long, you can easily avoid enemies, and the combat is super simple to get your head around. It basically just boils down to you repeatedly mashing a button so you can bludgeon whatever it is you're pointing at to death. It's also got maybe my favourite combat sound in any game ever. But it's the remake that isn't cozy for me. Way too stressful, a bit too grindy, it's over twice as long as the original, and there's also way too many jump scares to simply chill out. Also, remember what I said a second ago about does opening a map pause the game? That got binned off in the remake, so you can 100% get your booty cheeks clapped when you're trying to figure out the route from Neely's to the Woodside Apartments. If you don't get space, time, and control, you can't get comfortable, and that means you'll just stay scared. And I think, me, this random dude on the internet, think that that is the difference. Because when you do get those things, you get this infinitely replayable and rewatchable moment in time. On paper, no sense, right? The games are actively trying to stress you out, make you jump out of your skin, and some of the themes are just downright vile. Seriously, having to explain some of the games I'm covering to non-gamers like my parents or something is pretty hard sometimes. And despite that, they're some of the easiest games to just sit with, eventually anyway. You can load up one after a long day of real life, wander around somewhere avoiding becoming a Jill sandwich, maybe clear a couple of sections and just hang out. Conversely, you can fire up Twitch and watch someone scaring themselves senseless over something that used to freak you out too. There's nothing like a bit of schadenfreude to warm the cockles of an evening. I think a big part of it is that no matter how bad things get in a horror game, it's always still manageable. There's always something you can do. Even if you're totally stuck, you've got no ammo, everything's going to shit, there is always one pretty simple way out. It's fear held at an arm's reach, and that's pretty comforting. In the real world, we don't always get a clear objective, a neat solution, or a quiet room with some nice music to sit in while you figure things out. But in these games, you do. All games act as great distractions when we need them, but I think horror specifically acts as the perfect tonic or Restor's flask because of how distant it is from reality. I speak to a lot of people who are too scared to play them, and they'd always prefer to watch someone else play it so that they can still get the same experience. That's rad, and to those people, I salute you because you are the reason that I get to make these videos, and I'll forever be grateful for that. But I promise you that once you've played them enough to understand how they work, they really do stop feeling overwhelming. They just feel familiar, comfortable, cozy even. Which is probably why I'd rather chill at the Lakeview Hotel than deal with my social media notifications. Which is a bit worrying now I've said that out loud. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm aware that it is a little bit different, but I've been wanting to make this video for quite a while, and it felt like the right time to do it, seeing as we just hit 20k subs on the channel, which is fucking crazy, by the way. So thank you for anyone who's subscribed. I have a Discord server that just passed 500 people as well, so if you want to come and have a natter, come and join that. The link will be in the description, or it's the Lion WWF SmackDown. But there was one genre that took a little longer to find me. Horror. In April '98, along came issue 31 of the official PlayStation magazine and demo disc 14. Every month, that magazine felt like a treasure map, and this was the one that changed everything. On that disc was a game that would haunt me forever, and it wasn't Gex 3D. Absolute banger of a game, that, by the way. It was actually this. Resident Evil 2. Turning it on for the first time and watching the opening cutscene with Claire and Leon was genuinely terrifying. There's something about old horror games that made them way scarier than they actually were. They felt so real through the blur of a CRT screen, those low poly graphics mixed with the power of our imaginations. I never even managed to complete the demo. As soon as the cutscene ended, I'd smack the power button and sit there with my heart pounding, only to load it up again a few minutes later to scare myself senseless. I did this at a sleepover at my buddy's house, and after it scared us half to death, we made the executive decision to yeet the disc out of the bedroom window into his parents' conifers, never to be seen again. But it didn't stop me wanting to play the full game. And after picking it up a few months later, that's exactly what I did, over and over again, on my own, with my dad, and with my pals. What I didn't know back then was that the game that I was falling in love with had nearly been lost forever. The developers had literally thrown away months of work to start again. So, how does it feel to go back and play it again now? The original Resident Evil is the staple survival horror game, but its sequel was a reinvention. A game that would define not just the PlayStation era, but me too. The game picks up 2 months after the events of Resident Evil at the Spencer Mansion. A Special Forces division named STARS, under the jurisdiction of Raccoon City's police department, was sent to investigate a series of grisly murders in the nearby Arklay Mountains. What they found was a mansion hiding a secret Umbrella Corporation laboratory, the source of a viral outbreak known as the T-Virus, a bioweapon that reanimates dead tissue. Only a handful of the team survived, escaping as the mansion and its horrors went up in flames. With the evidence largely destroyed, they tried to warn the world, but no one would believe them. Umbrella covered everything up, and the research didn't stop. By the time Resident Evil 2 begins, the infection has spilled out of the labs and into the streets of Raccoon City, turning an isolated experiment to a full-scale nightmare. Capcom had no idea just how successful Resident Evil would be in 1996 and started work on its sequel just 1 month later. The intention was to tie up the loose ends from the first game and close the book on the series. Can you imagine if that actually happened, by the way? Crazy. The game they made is now referred to as Resident Evil 1.5 by the fandom. It starred Elsa Walker, a blonde motorcycle racer, and Leon Kennedy, a veteran cop who would make it to the final version but as a rookie instead. It was brighter, more action-focused, enemies dropped ammo, and the RPG looked clean and futuristic instead of gothic and decaying. Director Hideki Kamiya, from Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, was leading the project, but series creator Shinji Mikami felt that it lacked 2 key ingredients: atmosphere and horror. So, even though the game was around 70% done, he made a pretty bold call. Start again. This is where screenwriter Noboru Sugimura came in. Someone that had been writing TV shows since the 70s and would eventually become the lead writer for the series. The near total reboot became the Resident Evil 2 we know today. It's poetic, really. A game that reinvented itself before it even came out, the same way that it redefined the entire genre. The game was split onto 2 discs that follow the stories of Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the replacement for Elsa Walker, but she still got to keep the bike. Claire's playthrough begins with her arriving in Raccoon City to look for her brother Chris from the first game, but pulling over at a diner reveals that this is going to be anything but a straightforward family reunion.
I'm finally here.
Guys, I'm a maniac. Why'd he bite me?
Hello? Is anyone here? Hello? Hello? Look, I'm sorry I bothered you, okay? Just don't come any closer. Are you listening? Wait! Don't shoot!
Down! I'd stay out here. Head to the police station. It'll be a lot safer. There. Buckle up.
Okay. What's going on? I arrived in town, and the whole place went insane.
Your radio's out.
You're a cop, right?
Yeah, first day on the job. Great, huh? Name's Leon Kennedy. Nice to meet you.
Mine's Claire. Claire Redfield. I came to find my brother, Chris.
Hey, could you open the glove box?
Sure. There's a gun inside.
Better take it with you. You okay?
Still in one piece.
Claire!
Leon!
I'm okay. Head to the station. I'll meet you there.
Okay.
Considering how much the opening cutscene terrified me as a kid, it's weird how it's now so comforting. One thing you'll notice is that some of my footage is captured right here in front of this big-ass TV that I picked up on Gumtree for like a $5 on all of the original hardware, and some of it's from my PC. The PC version has been modded to upscale the cutscenes and backgrounds, and it's crazy how much of its aura it loses by doing that. That's no shade on the developers of this mod, by the way, and I'll link it below if you want to check it out, but it's wild how increasing the visual fidelity decreases the scare factor. As Claire, the game starts with you fleeing from the tanker crash through the streets filled with your first 3 enemies. Number 1, zombies, the most iconic enemy in horror gaming history. Ooh, it looks like this particular image came with some free hairs. Enjoy that. Number 2, the controls. Holy shit, it took me a minute to remember how tank controls worked. And number 3, the camera angles. Like the first game and a load of others in this era, Resi 2 worked on fixed camera angles. Gorgeous for the time, pre-rendered background images set the scene as 3D character models skate around on the surface. This was such a genius way of the devs squeezing as much as they could out of a console that, by today's standards, was basically a microwave. But they weren't just clever ways to circumvent technical limitations. Much like Silent Hill's use of fog to hide pop-in, they used these camera angles to hide their horror. Capcom studied cinematography to make you feel hunted even when you couldn't see what was coming. It makes every turn feel staged like a horror movie. And even all of these years later, there are certain camera changes that I don't want to trigger because I know what's coming. The first character you interact with is the gross gun shop dude who sounds like this.
Sorry about that, babe.
He manages to call you babe, darling, and girly within 10 seconds of meeting him, which probably wouldn't fly in a game made in 2025, but you won't have to worry about him for long. You bounce out of the gun shop and awkwardly wander through the chaos that is the streets of Raccoon City, with your main objective being to head for the police station to find Chris. It's not long before you get there, and you'll find that this is the weirdest bloody police station you have ever seen. And that's the point. This building was once an art museum, so all of the puzzles, statues, and paintings you encounter kind of make sense. It also works as a metaphor for beauty hiding corruption underneath, the perfect stage for Umbrella's lies. The original concept for the building was a modern police HQ, but Mikami wanted that gothic horror vibe again. That shift gave the game its iconic tone, and I will never forget the music used here. You soon meet a cop called Marvin who sounds like this. He tells you that they lost contact with all of the STARS team members, Chris included, 10 days ago. He then gets Claire clued up on the events of the first game and that Umbrella were behind everything. He gives you a key card, which means we can now fully explore this bizarre puzzle-filled station, which elegantly brings me onto the next section that made me want to slap the power button when I was a kid. One of the doors it unlocks is filled with nothing but silence, which is a little suspicious if you ask me. The fixed camera angles creep around the corner of the room, but tease a little reveal. What the fuck was that? The next room is also silent, except for the subtle sound of dripping in the distance. And this is where things are about to get real. No thanks, that's enough for me. Seriously though, I cannot tell you how much that cutscene used to scare me. As you can see behind me, the liquor isn't even hugely difficult to take out. Even now, through the static of an old TV, that fear feels more real than any 4K remake ever could. And that's not knocking the remake either. That thing fucking slaps. Liquors are what happens when the T-virus pushes the zombies' mutation to the extreme. Their skin peels away, muscles overgrow, and their bodies reform until they're barely even human anymore. In essence, the liquor is what happens when the infection stops trying to mimic humanity and starts perfecting the hunt. Thankfully, there are plenty of health items around here, including the iconic first aid spray and the humble green herb. Right after healing, you also get your first dose of the glorious savoury music. They actually made this banger at a tempo that matches a resting heart rate to subconsciously calm you down, which is a really nice touch. It didn't work, but it was a nice idea. After the liquor scare, the game settles into this amazing rhythm of combat, evasion, and puzzle solving that made the first game so good, but refines it. It had been years, maybe even decades since I'd last played this game, and coming back to it felt like throwing on an old pair of shoes. It was just immediately comfy. I couldn't remember why I knew how to solve some of the puzzles, or even the order I was supposed to do them in. I just did. If I could remember actually important things in real life as well as I remember this game, I would be dangerous, I swear. The story unfolds largely through letters, diaries, and sometimes older formats too. For example, that, my Gen Z friends, is a fax machine. Over time, you learn that the Chief of Police, Brian Irons, sick name by the way, is actually a bit of a dodgy geezer. He was the one that signed off on purchasing the art museum for its strategic location and collection of artistic works. This move put him in close proximity to Umbrella, a major employer in the city, but most importantly, it would begin to strengthen ties between himself and Umbrella employees, which would lead to his corruption. Over the past 5 years, he'd received monthly bribes from Umbrella, helped to cover up the incident at Spencer Mansion, and you also learn that he'd been arrested for violent crimes against women in his younger years. The story is way darker than I realised when I was like 9 years old when I was first playing this, but I'll explain more in a sec. Not long after this, I was trotting through this corridor that promptly sent my pants to Browntown when these flipping crows burst through the windows. I kind of forgot about this jump scare in all honesty. This serves me right for kicking a crow in my last Resident Evil video, doesn't it? That's awful, isn't it? Next up, you'll see a little girl running around the station, and saving her then becomes a priority that will play out alongside the larger plot. Before we find out who she is, though, we run into Irons.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I thought you were another one of those zombies.
Are you Chief Irons?
Yes, that's me. And just who are you? No, don't bother telling me. It makes no difference. You'll end up just like all the others. That's the mayor's daughter. I was told to look after her, but I failed miserably. Just look at her. She was a true beauty. Her skin nothing short of perfection. But it will soon putrefy and she will turn into a zombie within the hour like all the others.
There must be some way to stop it.
In a manner of speaking, there is. Either by putting a bullet through her brain, or by decapitating her completely. To think that taxidermy used to be my hobby. But no longer. Please. I'd really like to be alone now.
So if it wasn't clear already, this guy is a right weirdo. After this, we meet the little girl from earlier, Sherry, and she tells us that there's a much bigger monster roaming the station that seems to be looking for her specifically. She bolts, and when we return to Iron's office, he's vanished and taken the mayor's daughter's body with him like a little creep. Looking for Sherry again, I was reminded of why I don't like dogs in Resident Evil games, as I got my ass absolutely handed to me while getting stuck in a reload loop. After you find Sherry again, this is the first time you take control of her, which is fine. I know these sections get a lot of hate, and I totally get it. You do find an important key and some grenade launcher shells that she just casually tosses over the wall to Claire. As we assume control of Claire again, we carry on puzzle solving and running away from terrifying creatures, but there's one bit of text that stands out here. When interacting with a locker, you find a submachine gun and a side pack. Buzzing, right? Well, what's interesting is, after equipping the side pack, the prompt reads, I should probably save it for Leon. This is the first real mention of a contact known as zapping. At the time, zapping was a revolutionary idea that allowed players to affect the story of their second run in their first playthrough. In this case, if we take the Uzi 9mm now as Claire, it won't be here for us as our second run as Leon. Pretty cool, right? Back to the story, and a puzzle reveals a secret door in the police chief's office where we find a note from William Birkin. Man, I teased doing a video about this guy in the 7th video I ever made back in February, and I can't believe I actually get to talk about this guy now. The note confirms the bribes Irons received, but also mentions a replacement for the T-virus known as the G-virus. On the way through the tunnels connected to Iron's office, we're interrupted by a cutscene that shows an unknown creature shooting some kind of worm thing into Iron's gob for some reason. Now, while the sounds are still awesome, that clip looks so goofy without the blur of an old TV and the fog of memory. I can assure you, though, it's scary. But maybe that's what made it hit so hard for me as a kid. Back then, it wasn't about realism. It was about the blanks that your mind filled in. And something definitely gets lost when the imperfections are made so clear.
So you've made it this far. Not bad, girl. But I'm not letting anyone leave my town. Everyone's gonna die.
Calm down, Chief. What happened?
Shut up. You couldn't possibly understand what's happened. Those monsters from Umbrella have destroyed my beautiful town. How could they do that to me after everything I've done for them?
So it's true. You have been working with Umbrella. Then you must know about the G-virus. What is it? Tell me.
If you must know, it's the agent that can turn humans into the ultimate bioweapons. Superior to the T-virus in every way. Dr. William Birkin is the genius behind the project.
William Birkin.
I'm sure you've already seen this little girl running around here somewhere. Sherry, isn't it? In case you haven't already figured it out, the monster that's been tearing my precinct apart is yet another product of the G-virus. The ultimate bioweapon. Umbrella must be trying to cover its tracks. But if I have to go, I'm going to take you with me. My chest can't take the pain.
So that worm was actually a G-virus embryo that turns Irons into a lasagna, and it's only now we have a look at the room where he met his end. When I mentioned earlier that he was a weirdo, that barely scratched the surface. This room has chemicals and remains that would suggest that this guy isn't just a creep, he's actually a serial killer. This is expanded on in Resident Evil Outbreak 2, where a newspaper report suggests that 8 young, attractive blonde women had all gone missing. After they went missing, the constrained voices of women could be heard from a sewer drain for several hours, suggesting that these cries emanated from this very room. When I was a kid, I thought he was creepy because he was into taxidermy and took bribes. I didn't realise he was a bloody serial killer. Anyway, he's dead now. But what happened to that tiny little slimy chap that scurried out of him? Oh, gross. What is that? No, seriously, what is that? In this brief boss battle, the embryo reforms into whatever the hell this thing is and starts squirting out other little embryos that cling onto you. To shake them off, all you need to do is mash the buttons on your controller. However, since it's 2025 and those types of interactions are usually accompanied by a button press, I didn't realise this, and this will come back to haunt me very, very shortly. You head back to collect Sherry, who we now know is William Birkin's daughter, as she's going to accompany you from here on out. And if you thought the footsteps were loud and annoying before, they're about to be twice as annoying. Oh, and if you're wondering what that would sound like with a musical accompaniment, it'd probably go a little something like this. Shout out to my good friend and moderator Woodall for the music there. Come and join the Discord server if you want to annoy him. We take Sherry down into the epicenter of all of this, the sewers, but not before being interrupted by our old man. After getting washed away in the poopy sewer water, we take control of Sherry in a really short section that shouldn't cause us any problems, right? The only place to go is through a...
这一个冬季，就该收拾热情的过去，不要再缱绻北风里。冰冷的双手，也是最后的温柔。啊，你可知否？最后这一个冬季，就是我们感情的年底，不要再留恋过去。哀怨的双眸，也是最后的温柔，只是我不能再接受。不要再编织借口，就让我潇洒地走。虽然你的眼神说明了你依然爱我，这是最后的温柔。最后这一个冬季，就该收拾热情的过去，不要再缱绻北风里。冰冷的双手，也是最后的温柔。啊，你可知否？最后这一个冬季，就是我们感情的年底，不要再留恋过去。哀怨的双眸，也是最后的温柔，只是我不能再接受。不要再编织借口，就让我潇洒地走。虽然你的眼神说明了你依然爱我，这是最后的温柔。不要再编织借口，就让我潇洒地走。虽然你的眼神说明了你依然爱我，这是最后的温柔。不要再编织借口，就让我听到传来的谁的声音，像那梦里呜咽中的小河。我看到远去的谁的步伐，这就告别时哀伤的眼神。不明白的是为何你情愿让风尘刻画你的样子，就像早已忘情的世界，曾经拥有你的名字，我的声音。那悲歌总会在梦中清醒，诉说一点爱上过的往事。看似满不在乎，转过身的是风干泪眼后萧瑟的影子。不明白的是为何人世间总不能溶解你的样子。 曾经以为我的家是一张张的票根，撕开后展开旅程，投入另外一个陌生。这样飘荡多少天，这样孤独多少年，终点又回到起点，到现在才发觉。哦，路过的人我早已忘记，经过的事已随风而去，移动的心已渐渐平息，疲惫的我是否有缘和你相依？曾经以为我的家是一张张的票根，撕开后展开旅程，投入另外一个陌生。这样飘荡多少天，这样孤独多少年，终点又回到起点，到现在才发觉。路过的人我早已忘记，经过的事已随风而去，移动的心已渐渐平息，疲惫的我是否有缘和你相依？哦，路过的人我早已忘记，经过的事已随风而去，移动的心已渐渐平息，疲惫的我是否有缘和你相依？疲惫的我是否有缘和你相依？
惊醒我沉睡中的梦，迷惑的心沾满着昨日的伤痛。冷的风不再有往日的温柔，失去的爱是否还能够再拥有？那漫长路，谁能告诉我？究竟会有多少错？何处是我最终的居留？曾经在雨中对我说，今生今世相守。曾经在风中对我说，永远不离开我。 多少缠绵编织成的梦，多少爱恨刻画的镜头，为何一切到了终究还是空？惊醒我沉睡中的梦，迷惑的心沾满着昨日的伤痛。的风不再有往日的温柔，失去的爱是否还能够再拥有？漫漫长路，谁能告诉我？究竟会有多少错？何处是我最终的居留？曾经在雨中对我说，今生今世相守。曾经在风中对我说，永远不离开我。多少缠绵编织成的梦，多少爱恨刻画的镜头，为何一切到了终究还是空？多少缠绵编织成的梦，多少爱恨刻画的镜头，为何一切到了终究还是空？曾经在雨中对我说，今生今世相守。曾经在风中对我说，永远不离开我。多少缠绵编织成的梦，多少爱恨刻画的镜头，为何一切到了终究还是空？在雨中对我说，今生今世相守。曾经在风中对我说，永远不离开我。多少缠绵编织成的梦，多少爱恨刻画的镜头，为何一切到了终究还是空？
好，我是小李，都第3集了，可以开始吧。读心术，能够清楚地听见别人心中最真实的想法，无论在工作上或是人际关系中都有很大的帮助。能够清楚地听见别人的想法，真的是一件好事吗？这项技能到底是上天赐予的礼物，还是折磨呢？马上和大家分享今天的第一则故事。故事的主角名叫鸟流，自称是一名插画家，生活中的开销靠着打工画画还过得去。一日，在没有事先通知的情况下，就直接来到好友家，而好友刚结婚，正是甜蜜的新婚时期，就这样被鸟流打扰了。虽然气氛有些尴尬，但好友还是邀请鸟流坐下来慢慢聊。而鸟流此次前来，就是要和好友分享，终于有人要委托他画插画了。好友当然也献上祝福。想不到鸟流一聊就聊到深夜了，不光是没有顾虑到好友夫妻的感受，甚至在人家家喝到烂醉。好友的妻子也礼貌地询问：鸟流先生不用回去工作吗？但鸟流眼花耳热地回应着：工作延迟1天也没关系，今天就喝个通宵吧。好友妻子这时才想到，今晚亲戚要来家里拜访，马上就要到了。说完，鸟流也才先行告辞。回家的路上，鸟流心想，自己一直以来似乎给身边的朋友和前辈带来许多麻烦，但大家从来不会对他摆脸色。想想大家都是好人呢。回到家，打开门，想不到一对男女在他家相互依靠看着电视，原来是鸟流的弟弟。弟弟表示，因为自己执意要和女友结婚，所以被爸爸赶出家门了。虽然爸爸觉得弟弟在胡搞，但弟弟认为他和女友彼此相爱就可以胜过一切。而这种不顾父母反对的执着，当初坚持要做插画家的哥哥应该能明白吧。就这样，弟弟和他女友就留下来过夜了。第二天，鸟流呕心沥血地完成了插画，在送件的途中，发现一颗静静躺在草地上的橡果，没有多想就将它收进口袋。而原本平静的生活，也因为这颗橡果激起了涟漪。不同于以往城市车水马龙的喧嚣声，鸟流被另一种声音层层包围着。经过公园的鸟流，无意间发现一旁没有开口说话的大叔竟然正在说话，以及在长椅上睡觉的男子和一旁草丛中亲热的男女，鸟流都能听见他们的心声。这时鸟流才明白，原来带着那颗橡果就能洞察人心。这突如其来的超能力让鸟流兴奋不已，急忙赶去出版社提交插画，心想着这样就能听见主编的心声和评价，而非透过客套出来的结果了。来到出版社，主编看着插画的内容，嘴巴上说着：“哦，你的作品非常正统啊。”鸟流也正要补充自己多努力看待这份作品时，一个声音却传进他的耳中：“唉，但说真的，内容实在有点老套啊。”这才是主编真实的想法。鸟流听见以后，急忙提出自己还是回家再改一下好了。而主编嘴上说着：“哦，太好了，我非常期待哦。”但心里却想着，也没什么好期待的啦，但总不能跟他直说吧。鸟流马上意识到，这颗果实并非想象中的甜美。一路上，群众刺耳的心声不断传入耳中，内容充满了愤怒、嫉妒与孤独。虽然讨厌这种能力带来的痛苦，但鸟流经不起好奇心的驱使，带着橡果来到好友家。开门迎接的好友笑脸迎人的说着：“嗨，欢迎你来。”但心里却想着：“哎，怎么又来了？”好友的妻子表面上说着：“来吧，快点请进。”心中却想着：“真是不懂客气的人啊。”接着鸟流开始和好友诉苦，说自己呕心沥血的作品被嫌老套的事情。好友也加油打气的告诉鸟流：“不要灰心嘛，你的才能啊，总有一天会被看见的。”心里想着，早点放弃这种邪门歪道吧，乖乖找一份工作不好吗？好友妻子这时也不好意思的说着：“家中的啤酒刚好没了，喝茶方便吗？”心里想着，要是喝了酒，一定又会赖着不走的。静坐在两位笑容可掬的夫妻面前，鸟流不断听着他们的心声，该不会是要来借钱的吧？这种神经大条的朋友真是让人困扰。但见面3分情，这也算是一种品德吧。此刻鸟流心中明白，即便听见这些心声，也不能认为对方虚伪。对方没有说出真心话，也是为了顾虑自己的感受吧。离开好友家后，鸟流觉得那个他以为大家都是好人的世界顿时改变了。而且这颗橡果不只能听见心声，连潜意识的声音都能听见。弟弟所谓的父母根本就不了解我嘛，其实是他们都不会顺我的意来了解我。弟弟女友所谓的既然是父母，本来就该相信孩子的行为啊，其实是就算知道我说谎，也该大方被我骗嘛。嘴上说着彼此相爱就能胜过一切，但心里不过是想那个而已。 受不了这种鬼话连篇的鸟流提醒弟弟，也差不多该去找份工作了吧？一直待在这边让人很困扰哎。想不到弟弟却说，该搬出去的是哥哥你吧？原来刚才房东来过，说鸟流已经欠了一堆房租了。于是弟弟马上和房东拟定新合约，所以现在房东已经将房子租给弟弟了。气愤不已的鸟流无奈打架也打不赢弟弟，只能摸摸鼻子离开了。无处可去的他，在月光下思考着，如果人类从以前就具备读心的能力，可能就无法产生社会与文明了吧？也许这种橡果就是为了让人类社会解体才发明出来的。说完便将橡果扔了出去，但马上又后悔了，因为鸟流想再做最后一次实验，于是开始在森林中寻找橡果，还找到2颗。接着鸟流将橡果分别放进弟弟和弟弟女友的口袋中，想当然尔，那个说着只要有爱就能胜过一切的坚定，瞬间就摧毁了。最后鸟流将橡果碾碎之后丢弃，虽然现在他再也听不见别人的心声了，但他心中原本那个美好又安定的世界也再也回不来了。曾经听过一句这样的话，世界上有2样东西不能直视，一是太阳，2是人心。虽然以前总是会非常的执着，想要知道别人心中最真实的想法，甚至还会用就直接告诉我实话，给我一个痛快嘛，来包装自己的好奇心。但随着年纪的增长，渐渐就会觉得别人心中是怎么想的一点也不重要，重要的是他说了什么和他做了什么。内心的想法是人性，表达出来的是修养。既然如此，我们又何必跨越这份修养去洞察人性呢？大家身边有讨厌的人吗？这样的人可能是行为让人讨厌，也可能是个性让人讨厌。但无论如何，这种人通常不会顾虑别人的感受，总是让周围的人产生许多的内耗。如果有机会让这样的人消失，你愿意付出多少努力呢？但到头来，到底是这样的人比较可怕，还是想让这样的人消失的人比较可怕呢？让我们看完西村的遭遇，再来思考这个问题。故事一开始，西村委屈的和老婆解释，突然被指派去大和老师家拿原稿，也是非不得已的。自己并没有忘记今天的约会，只是会晚点到而已。但电话那头的老婆无法体谅西村的苦衷，突然一只猴子跳上西村的头，抢走他的文件后快步逃离。西村急忙追赶，也一边好奇市区怎么会有猴子呢？这时，猴子逃回主人身边，这位猴子的主人正是西村要去拜访的大和老师。于是2人就一起前往老师家拿原稿了。一路上，大和也和西村炫耀，这只猴子是食蟹猴，是生于马来西亚的外来品种，非常罕见。回到家后，大和的老婆恭敬地欢迎丈夫回来，想不到大和严厉地教训了他，指责让猴子逃出去都是他的错。突如其来的火爆场面让西村措手不及，但大和也解释，家中出事本来就该由老婆负责，千万别见怪。说完，便来到书房邀请西村坐下来喝一杯，但西村表示自己不宜久留，拿到原稿就要离开了。但大和一脸狐疑地说：“好，原稿。”原来大和根本还没开始写，却又宣称只要他一动笔，马上就能完成。无奈之下，西村只好坐下来和大和喝一杯，并等他完成原稿。这时，大和手中的酒瓶空了，大声斥喝妻子拿酒过来，并愤怒地将酒瓶向外摔。真的要跳出来说一下，这人情绪控管有问题啊！妻子马上端来新的酒，却还是受到大和的教训，这让一旁的西村连忙道歉，虽然自己也不知道为了什么而道歉。西村眼看无法如期完成工作，便向大和借了电话和公司回报此事。而一出房门，差点踩到刚才的酒瓶，西村就顺手将酒瓶摆在门边。想不到和公司汇报后，主编才和西村说，大和就是这样的人，个性蛮横又爱脱稿，所以叮咛西村要在一旁盯着他完成原稿才行。无奈的西村这时才发现，原来自己接了一份大家都不想碰的工作。挂上电话后，大和的妻子邀请西村留下来用晚餐，虽然西村推辞，但妻子还是请他吃完炸虾盖饭再回去吧。这时西村回到大和的书房，差点又被躺在地上的酒瓶绊倒，这也让西村不解，酒瓶刚刚不是摆好了吗？但比起这种小事，与老婆的约会更让西村心急。西村便和大和说，明天再来取原稿。想不到大和居然要西村在一旁督促他，否则自己根本提不起劲。无奈的西村只好致电给老婆说明此事，当然对方无法谅解。来到厕所后，浓浓的沼气熏得西村睁不开眼睛。想不到大和家还在用这么早期的厕所，更离谱的是，居然还有在厕所抽烟的习惯。这种种的一切都让西村不解。这时西村想和大和太太要今天的报纸，而太太正在做简报，惊讶地看着西村后又平复了心情。西村一面看着被剪过的报纸，一面走回大和的书房。突然间，踩到的酒瓶让西村滚下楼梯，摔个四脚朝天。当然，这样的过失 时，再度让大和愤怒地责备妻子。许久以后，大和似乎没有动笔的打算，开着电视看着濑户内海的观光节目。西村在一旁无奈地说：“今天是自己结婚1周年的纪念日。”想不到大和也说：“真巧，今天是自己的生日。”完全没有体谅别人的意思。接着大和说，他要开始构思下部作品的题材了，马上就要前往濑户内海一趟，并指定西村一同前往，以及他也可以一起去。说完便使唤妻子拿来电话，电话那头是一位名叫刘美的女子。大和请对方30分钟内过来一起和他旅行。大和似乎也为这样的行为感到洋洋得意。这时电话又响了，原来是西村的老婆打来找人。虽然这样的举动让西村尴尬不已，但一旁的大和却喜滋滋的当作节目观看。由于西村迟迟不回家，西村的老婆一怒之下决定回娘家去，就请西村慢慢的工作吧。挂了电话后，大和和西村说，是西村没有管教好老婆，等一派荒诞的沙文主义发言。当然，西村无法理解，也不予置评。这时，一位穿着时髦的女子来到大和家，她就是电话中的刘美。大和看到她后，仿佛变了个人，低声下气的。但刘美也说自己不要和大和去旅行，要和其他男人去兜风。这时，一旁的西村看了报纸，也建议大和不要去旅行比较好，因为本周大和旅行的运势为大凶。但此刻，大和的妻子已经将行李整理好了，还请大和务必带着刘美一起去旅行。恼羞成怒的大和突然不想去了，并教训妻子说他多管闲事。一旁的刘美看到这样的画面，说了一句：“大和总有一天会被他老婆解决掉的。”就离开了。到了傍晚，妻子为大和准备了晚餐，为鱼生鱼片和竹荚鱼。大和也抱怨，虽然好吃是好吃，但怎么每天都吃一样的东西呢？但马上大和接着说：“算了，男人不该插嘴厨房的事，忘了刚才的话吧。”妻子说了抱歉后，又离开了房间。大和这时也向西村坦白，其实自己真的很喜欢妻子的，虽然没有说出口，但他应该也能明白，毕竟两人也结婚20年了。大和也补充道，其实这只猴子也是妻子送给他的礼物，因为自己非常喜欢动物。说完对妻子真情告白的同时，酒瓶中的酒也见底了。大和再度斥喝妻子拿酒来，这突如其来的转变，想必比他的作品还要精彩啊！这时大和也说自己构思好作品了，名称叫做《守株待兔》。故事中的主角是一位消极被动、等待机会到来的人，灵感是来自一首关于守株待兔的日本童谣。说到一半，大和发现妻子迟迟没有将酒送来，正要大发雷霆，但西村希望大和快点着手动笔，自己去找他妻子说一声就好了。走出书房的西村，笼罩着夜幕带来的渲染，整个家不同于上午那般明亮。西村发现大和太太正在洗澡后，就自行到卧房找酒，而打开房门，看到大和太太的简报，便好奇地拿起来看看。谁知道简报的内容却让他冷汗直流。关于在老师厕所抽烟引发沼气爆炸的恐怖新闻，踩到楼梯口的玩具摔下来造成颈部骨折的意外新闻，外来动物引发传染病造成病毒侵蚀脑部和神经系统的新闻，以及使用过多受污染鱼类造成身体危害的新闻，种种的讯息都和今日在大和家遇到的谜题环环相扣。原来那些不解的原因背后藏着如此可怕的动机。忐忑不安的西村离开了卧房，听见书房中的大和正在唱着童谣。这时大和太太再度将酒瓶放到最危险的位置，守株待兔。看完这篇故事，大家认为是大和的妻子比较可怕，还是将妻子逼成如野兽一般的大和比较可怕？生活中总是有人不断在挑战别人的极限，等踢到了铁板一样才在抱怨，平常怎么没人告诉他呢？不要把别人逼成了野兽，才抱怨别人残忍。能够笑脸迎人，谁愿意恶言相向？大家有看过仿的院线电影吗？就是那种名字和院线片很像，但又有一点点不一样的电影，看到一半才会发现。环太平洋这么难看吗？环大西，无论大家是否有这样惨痛的经验，但我认为再怎么惨，也不会有接下来故事中的主角还要惨。虽然不是什么大不了的事，但我希望各位听听我最近看到的2部电影，有些让人在意的地方。在日本海侧的某个后町，有一条叫做小巷的巷子，我是无意间经过那个地方的，细节我就不交代了。巷弄的深处有一间老旧的电影院，正播放着2部当红的院线电影，应该说是我以为是那2部当红的院线电影《星际大战：绝地大反攻》和《南极物语》。由于一张票可以看2部电影，就算厅内设施破旧，我也不那么计较了。但奇怪的是，影厅内除了我，就没有其他人了。在位置上等待了许久，电影终于开始播放。这部电影是由高仓健主演， 耗资25亿日元制作，但不知道为什么看了许久，始终没有高仓健，反而不断出现在画面中。拥有蓬松雪白毛皮的海豹母子更像主角。久而久之，我渐渐对这对母子投入感情。电影中段，原本没有人类气息的北极，突然来了直升机、雪地观测站以及拉着雪橇的大狗，这不禁让我好奇，难道这部电影是纪录片吗？接着，小海豹遇上恋人，北极的永夜也随之来临，人们开始落荒而逃，而无人看管的雪橇大狗也在极光下开始死亡，朝着海豹们发动无差别攻击。就这样日复一日，海豹们迎来前所未有的悲剧。小海豹正要被攻击时，人们的探险直升机再度回来，赶跑了大狗。小海豹站上高地，在闪耀的阳光中，感人的音乐响起，电影就结束了。说真的，当时我完全搞不清楚状况，但紧接着疑似星际大战的电影马上开始播放，我就没那么在意了。毕竟这部片在东京上映时可是一票难求啊。电影一开始交代一位伐木少年阿克与他的新婚妻子小花的甜蜜新婚生活，但突然一张信件打乱他们的平凡日子。原来是皇帝的召集令，阿克被征召进入镇压叛乱军的部队。闻此消息，阿克的父母也非常不舍，但同时也告诉阿克，这正是为国效命、报答皇恩的时刻。而让阿克纳闷的是，皇帝何时有恩于我们呢？但军令一下，不敢不从。阿克就这样进入部队了。部队的首要目标就是在太空建立巨大的要塞——死线，并对抗叛乱军，保卫基地不被入侵。在这期间，阿克也认识了好友达克，两人平时总是结伴出任务。但在一次任务途中，叛乱军的攻击让达克牺牲了。从那时开始，阿克便发誓要将叛乱军铲除。为了能够在第一线对付叛乱军，阿克决定加入战斗机联队。没多久，叛乱军也展开总攻击。阿克驾驶着战斗机，用自己的生命报效了国家。这一天，数以千计的年轻生命依然深信帝国不灭，陨落在浩瀚的宇宙之中。悲伤的音乐响起，电影结束了。离开电影院时，黄昏的夕阳使得天气留着些许温暖，但我的心情却依然沉重。被骗了350元，真可惜啊！看完这篇故事，大家应该就能明白支持正版的重要性。除此之外啊，故事中仿星际大战的那部电影真的是太有趣了，居然是用风暴士兵的角度来看待这一场战争，而对风暴士兵有多一点了解以后，是不是也能理解他们的苦衷呢？藤子 F 不二雄先生是经历过战争和战后生活的人，所以他清楚的知道，真正的战争比影视作品中来的残忍。也正是因为如此，在老师以往的作品当中，包含哆啦 A 梦的故事里面，常常可以看到反战的剧情。毕竟面对战争，要付出代价的永远是平民老百姓，而非挑起战争。如同小夫的阿吉堂哥在遥控大海战这一集的故事当中说的：“哎，花钱又没有意义，战争就是如此啊。”对这个世界多一点了解，少一点偏见。今天的影片就到这边，喜欢我的影片记得也要喜欢你们这集快乐的样子哦。
其中还包括一些广告和业配的收入。手机也不贵，怎么不贵？这才得3000多啊！这个手机我才花了1000多呢。马放真香啊，咱不配点啥喝了？我带了这个，你做米酒。对就是那么开店投资的几万块都赔光，但以似乎的收益来看，他们也还是赚了。
大家好，我是小李。
他们之后开超市倒闭的原因，竟然是因为
你太快了吧！超人和吸血鬼在大家心中，正义与反派的位置是不是已经非常明确了呢？但事实真的是如此吗？一位原本正义的人，在获得绝对的力量以后，还能保持心目中原本的正义吗？而他心中原本的正义，又是以什么标准来衡量的呢？马上为大家带来今天的第一则故事。故事中的小池先生是一位过度富有正义感，演变成愤世嫉俗的中年大叔，而他的长相和姓氏都恰巧与哆啦 A 梦中爱吃拉面的小池先生、忍者哈特利中的小池老师很像，但应该就是恰巧很像而已。这样的现象在异色短片中也很常见。小池先生每天出门，看到有人破坏社会秩序，便会破口大骂；看到不顺眼的事情，就会打电话检举。而这样无论对谁都直言不讳的性格，也让小池先生感到骄傲。而一旁卖香烟的婆婆也讽刺地说道：“这样的个性真不错啊，大声对别人咆哮，好像自己就变伟大了吧？”小池反驳道：“虽然自己的力量很渺小，但只要他努力不懈，世界一定会变得更好。甚至周围的人都用正义使者来称呼他。”婆婆则回应：“有这样的嗜好也真不错，还不用花钱呢。”鸡同鸭讲，小池先生也这么认为。来到公司后，小池依然在写投诉信，要把自己的不满告诉各大媒体。但这时，小池的老板也提醒他，如果有空，能不能发挥正义感，多做点公司的事呢？这让小池非常无语。 认为老板如果像他一样在意社会，就不会只想着公司的事。行走在暗巷中的小池看到前方有陌生男子要非礼一位女性，便勇敢地上前劝阻，无奈对方凶神恶煞。好在附近刚好有警察，才化险为夷。护送女子回家的路上，女子介绍自己名叫雪子，非常欣赏小池的正义感，并邀请他下次来自己家做客。这让小池感到兴奋不已，心想着雪子就像邪恶世界中绽放的一朵百合花。回到家看电视的小池，电视的讯号被附近邻居干扰，义愤填膺的他马上打电话斥喝对方。想不到夜晚的咆哮声反而吵到了其他租客，愤怒又无奈的小池唾弃这乱七八糟的世界，心想如果自己能更强大就好了。小池带着如此的心情进入了梦乡。隔天起床，吃着拉面的小池突然发现眼前的场景有些不同，原本应该一成不变的墙壁，竟然变成邻居家中的场景。反复确认后，小池才惊觉自己获得了透视眼的能力。拍案叫绝的瞬间，家中的茶几也被小池一掌拍碎。惊讶的他跳了起来，想不到整个人直冲天际。这种种的迹象让小池确定自己一定是被老天选上伸张正义的超人。兴奋的他马上飞到雪子家分享此事，想不到轻轻一瞄，就看到雪子正要如厕的画面。虽然心中渴望，但小池凭借正义之名停止了这样的行为。接着，小池开始用自己的能力惩奸除恶，教训吸食违禁品的青年，痛扁在深夜飙车制造噪音的飙车族，揭发政商勾结的不法行为。而之前非礼女性那位凶神恶煞的男子，小池也不再害怕，狠狠地教训了对方。而这样实施正义的行为，让小池兴奋不已，血脉膨胀。回过神来，才发现自己酿了不可挽回的悲剧。但懊悔的小池马上说服了自己，他认为这些社会毒瘤本来就该消失，自己不过是在替天行道，自己就是正义。由于每天忙着惩奸除恶，来到公司的小池往往都在打瞌睡，马上就被老板教训。但气愤的小池一点也不在乎，递出辞呈告诉老板，哈哈，在这间公司根本是浪费时间，并指着老板说：“消失吧！”没多久，当小池离开老板办公室，其他员工慌乱地前去关心。就在刚才，老板突然心肌梗塞过世了。小池虽然有点不安，但他不认为老板是因为自己的诅咒才过世的。经过熟悉的香烟摊，婆婆讽刺地问着小池：“怎么样啊，正义使者？今天的生意好吗？”小池马上在心中愤怒地想着：“消失吧！”隔天，婆婆也过世了。接着，小池开始用自己心中的正义来定义世间的善恶。所有违背他看了不顺眼的人，统统都会消失。小池深信，这些行为都是为了社会而执行的正义。忙了一天的小池再度飞到雪子家与他见面，但雪子正在洗澡。原本坚持不用超能力来满足私欲的小池，早已被无尽的力量冲昏了头，用了一套说辞说服了自己，便马上开始偷窥。但此时，雪子家中来了一位中年男子，居然亲密地和雪子拥抱在一起。小池顿时怒发冲冠地喊叫着：“你们这些地下的虫子，别惹我生气啊！只要我高兴，毁灭世界也不算什么啊！”伴随着失控的愤怒与无尽的力量，正义使者小池真迷狂。其实，在故事一开始啊，小池先生的确是一位路见不平、拔刀相助的人，只可惜使用的方法过于激进，让原本的善意在别人心中成为了恶意。比起让这个社会变得更好，感觉小池更享受教训别人所带来的成就感。而最让人惋惜的就是，当他获得绝对的力量以后，心中原本的正义也不再那么纯粹了。大家身边也有这样的人吗？原本是大家心中向往、憧憬的目标，但在获得权力和能力以后，却变得不像从前的自己。而像小池先生这样的人，未来到底会如何发展呢？其实，在异色短片当中，还有一篇故事疑似交代了小池先生的未来。我们一起看下去吧。与上一篇故事不知道隔了多久的时间，故事中的主角是一位外表、个性、拥有的能力都和上一篇的小池一模一样的人，名叫巨乐坚人。而为什么会改名，在故事的最后再来分享我的看法。故事中的巨乐已经成为公司的经理，每天都在办公室内看报纸，但报纸的内容都是好人好事的新闻。我猜想，这应该是政府特地为巨乐印制的报纸，避免他动用私刑。由于报纸内容太无聊，巨乐呼唤会计，算好薪水拿来给他，便要下班。只见会计一进门，表现出异常的害怕与紧张。巨乐拿过薪水，指责对方这样的行为就是自我意识过剩导致。巨乐大摇大摆地离开公司，所有人见到都避而远之，连以前的同事片山看到他都直冒冷汗，害怕说错什么话得罪了他，自己要付出生命作为代价。但巨乐邀请片山今晚来家里做客，像以前一样畅快地喝酒聊天。闻此邀约，片山仿佛听见丧钟，双腿一软答应了邀请。在去巨乐家之前，片山先回家告诉妻子这个噩耗，并跟妻子告别，说如果有个万一， 请好好照顾自己。由此可知，到聚乐家做客，如同奔赴战场一般危险。片山开着车渐渐远离了市区，来到一处荒郊野外，前方正是管制区的哨站。守卫得知片山要去拜访聚乐后，面带哀伤的放行。接着汽车再度来到一座城市，应该说曾经是城市的一座废墟。断垣残壁中，隐约记载着过去发生了惨烈的攻击。突然，一位女子声音喊破，让片山的车大往撞上了护栏。眼看与聚乐约定的时间快到了，片山只好奋力向前冲，生怕迟到会让聚乐不开心。此时，漆黑的夜空中闪耀着如流星般的光芒，却丝毫没有带给片山希望。传说中的金光闪闪无敌超人粉墨登场，说明自己是惩奸除恶的正义使者。得知片山要去找聚乐后，便直接拎着他来到聚乐家。此刻无敌超人也不好意思的坦诚，其实自己就是他的好友聚乐奸人。但片山也真的看得出来，不过为了让聚乐满意，还是演出惊讶的样子。进到聚乐家中，聚乐一脚将沙发踹开，和片山席地而坐。但这一切都让片山如坐针毡，硬是挤出了话题和聚乐聊天。对了，你是怎么突然成为那个什么超人的？聚乐也和片山解释，其实自己原本只是一位。
终究是一场空。谁说我俩的过去尽在不言中？别忘了我曾拥有你，你也曾爱过我。当你留给我，我不想接受的伤痛，爱情到头来还是梦。别说我俩的世界有太多不同，就说你已经忘了我，你就要离开我。谁能够告诉我是否付出太多？就当我从来没有过，还是消失在我心头。谁曾经提醒我的爱没有把握？就当我从来没有过，还是忘了你，忘了我。当你留给我，我不想接受的伤痛，爱情到头来还是梦。别说我俩的世界有太多不同，就说你已经忘了我，你就要离开我。谁能够告诉我是否付出太多？就当我从来没有过，还是消失在我心头。谁曾经提醒我的爱没有把握？就当我从来没有过，还是忘了你，忘了我。谁 从来没有过，还是忘了你。我